very warm welcome, please, for John Restakis.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's really nice to be here. Thanks everybody for showing up at the last session of this Sunday. I know you've been meeting pretty intensively over the last couple of days. I am going to be speaking for about 40 or 45 minutes. Although I will be focusing on a portion of my presentation on Emilia-Romagna, I do want to open up this last session, if I can, to a very large frame of reference to contextualize both what the discussions here have been about around social economy development and support here in Montreal, to larger regional level systems that I will be explaining in terms of the example of Emilia-Romagna, Northern Italy, but also try and draw in some of my thoughts stemming from my experience recently in Greece and the crisis, the economic crisis that's unfolding in Greece and in Europe more broadly, and how the ideas that we're talking about concerning social economy and alternative forms of political economy and economic democracy relate to those larger questions systemically, not just on the basis of isolated projects, but the creation of transition institutions and systems that generate paradigm shift and systems change. So basically, I'm going to try and tell you everything I know in one PowerPoint presentation. We'll see if this works. It won't work. I'm sure it won't work. Okay, so that's the title of this, and we'll see if I can actually pull this off. The key themes I want to touch on, this notion of lifeboats or paradigm change. The work I've been doing over the last 20 years and longer has often got me thinking and oscillating between two points of view in terms of what my work is all about. Am I building lifeboats to help save what's salvageable? Or is the work that I'm doing, and many of you here are doing, really gearing up and transitioning towards paradigm change? And it's something I'll come back to over the course of this presentation, but I'm not really sure whether it's lifeboats or paradigm change we're talking about. I hope it's the latter. But if it's only the former, you know, that's not bad. That's good enough. Debtocracy, the rise of national indebtedness to financial institutions, and the rise of a whole new pattern of enclosures, focusing on public goods, public assets, and the delivery of public wealth to private hands by governments. The rise of civil power as a reaction and response to this wholesale expropriation of commons and public assets. And then a very interesting emergence of an alignment between the cooperative movement and the new commons movement, which has gained a lot of traction and interest over this last, in particular over the last 6 or 7 years, very largely due to the work of my good friend and collaborator, Michel Bowens, who spoke earlier today. And then what does all this mean in terms of a new pattern and form of political economy and governance? And so I want to introduce the notion of the partner state and how that relates to the kind of examples that I'll be talking about in Italy, and also the kind of possibilities that may exist here in Quebec. So I begin with this notion of the treason of the state. What has happened over this last 30 years, really, 30 or 40 years, but really accelerating over the past 30 and 20 years, is the betrayal of the public interest and the undermining of the civil foundations that legitimize the state through citizenship and democratic accountability of political power. What is happening very, very clearly is the absence of economic democracy is what is ultimately destroying political democracy. We are witnessing this in frightful ways in the United States today. The rise of the fascistic right embedded now within the Republican Party and in the person of Donald Trump. And the gathering momentum of right-wing movements that are now becoming increasingly mainstream movements in Europe. So what is emerging, in my view, is that the purpose of the state today is really to transfer the management of public wealth and commons and public resources into private hands. That has emerged as the primary purpose and role of the state in Europe today. Frightfully obvious, for example, with the David Cameron government in the UK, and all the subject economies in the southern periphery of Europe, to Germany primarily. And that this current dogma of austerity and neoliberalism requires that the state be explicitly anti-democratic, and that its accountability is now being transformed into very sophisticated forms of manipulation and coercion as the only means by which it can legitimize its continuance. So then, what is the goal of civil power within this larger framework? What, in fact, is actually possible in terms of what we can do as individuals, as organizations, as citizens, as activists, as academics, as students, and so on? What actually is really possible? Can sovereignty actually be recovered in the age of globalization? Sovereignty, even at the national state level, is this actually possible? And will the centers of political and economic power actually allow a peaceful transition to a new kind of social contract that respects democracy, that accounts for citizenship, and that aims towards a more socially just economy and politics? Is this possible? I'm not sure it is possible. It's an open question. What this does mean, if it's to happen, is a paradigm shift, a new change in terms of our political economy, and a new social contract within that's limited to the industrial democracies of the West in North America. And in my view, what does this social economy, or rather the social contract, entail? It entails a focus on social justice. It entails a priority around environmental sustainability in terms of our economic development, meaningful employment, guaranteed basic living income, equalization of wealth. It means economic democracy, which ultimately means the social control of capital. It means open technology, the social control of technology, distributed political democracy, which means civil control of government, and user control over public services. And it means the protection and expansion of commons, the commodification of public assets, of natural resources, and of knowledge and information. A new social contract, I think, has to embody and entail all these elements. And the question is, how does this happen? What are the kinds of policies and what are the kinds of possibilities that we can see as models for this kind of shift? I last year spent a good part of the year in Greece at the time of these intense negotiations between the Greek government and the Syriza government and the debt holders in the rest of Europe. And the crystallization of this notion of debtocracy, the national indebtedness to private capital, became very clear and very explicit. And I think there are deep lessons for us in our work here from the experience of Greece. And I will come back to this at the end of the presentation. But what it does highlight is that the new capital order institutionalizes inequality, oligarchy, the lack of sustainability, and a permanent instability a precariousness that is now being systematized within our economic models. So the new enclosures that are underway within this new order include the end of the public, the notion of the public, the very idea of the public, and the enclosures and privatization of land, water, resources, knowledge, and I would say ultimately everything that can be enclosed is targeted for enclosure. And so we have the resistance, we have the reaction, we have the rise of the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States some years ago, and then of course in Canada, the rise of the Plaza movements in Europe, and really a quite extraordinary refocusing of the political dialogue and the political debate around the question of class. The one great achievement of the Occupy movement was to bring the issue of class front and center and on the front pages of the newspapers in the United States, in Canada, and now all across the West. So there has been a rise in civil power recently. The Occupy movement, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Pirate Party now, all of these citizen movements aligned within political parties are highlighting the crisis of legitimacy that has now become endemic in all of these industrial economies. And what it points to is the urgency for a new form of political economy. And if we do not transition to a new form of political economy, not only Greece, not only Spain, not only Italy, not only the United States, is playing with fire, is playing with total capitulation to tautocracy, the entrenchment of oligarchy, and the demise of not only liberalism, but the democratic forms of politics that we become accustomed to and have mistakenly taken for granted over this last 40 or 50 or 60 years. So the mass uprisings that have been taking place sporadically but consistently all across Europe, the Arab Spring movement in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and as part of this, the rise of both Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece. All of this, or rather so much of this, not all of it, but so much of this centers on this question of the absence of social control over capital. And this, in fact, harkens back to the origins and the rise of the cooperative movement and what Karl Polanyi refers to as a great transformation through the realization of the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century. And as most of you will know, at that time, the emerging concentration of capital, the complete realignment of production systems from the countryside into factories located in cities, the expropriation and enclosure of previously commons land, the de-skilling and disenfranchisement and disemployment of craftspeople, and the wholesale reformation and reorganization of production and distribution and ultimately consumption through the factory system. Now this is, the sort of iconic textile mills in Manchester in the 18 and early 1900s. And what was going on was all these things I'm talking about: urbanization, factory production, the rise of centralized forms of technology, control of international trade, and the emergence of globalization. But what is fascinating to me is that the globalization of capital today exactly replicates the rise of capital in the Industrial Revolution during the 1800s in a new form. So like then, traditional forms of work, small-scale, village-based work, and the operation of markets within a social framework, in other words, markets based within social values and aiming at social ends, are being disrupted. Economic power is being centralized in the hands of unaccountable corporations at global scales in ways that exactly replicate the dynamics of capital accumulation, expropriation, enclosure, centralization, and disenfranchisement, both economically and politically, at the start of the Industrial Revolution. This here happens to be a Nike factory in China. So the rise of precarious employment, instability, and disenfranchisement is now become global. So cooperatives, I mean, I know there's been a lot of talk about co-ops here in this conference. Cooperatives were one of the forms, as well as trade unions, and the assertion of commons rights, that arose as a reaction, as a form of social self-defense against this process of economic disenfranchisement. And it went hand in hand with the movement for the acquisition of political rights. The rise of trade unions and the rise of the cooperative movement were closely linked, intertwined with the movement for universal suffrage, for the right of everyone to have a vote in the political system, for discussion and the promotion of women's rights as citizens. All of this was intertwined and made huge advances in the political arena. You know, the rise of parliamentary democracy, democratic political systems, and so on, really had their birth and momentum during this period. But it did not extend to the economy. It did not extend to the democratization of economics, but only politics. And so ultimately, as I was saying earlier today in this presentation, the lack of extension and the democratization of economics has now led to the demise and destruction of democracy in politics. But today, again, as part of this process, co-ops are reemerging as a form of social defense against the damaging effects of unrestricted capital and the free market system. But there is also a flip side to this, and that is, I mean, I worked in the cooperative movement for 20 years, and I don't know anyone that's been a more passionate advocate and supporter of co-ops than myself. But I also recognize the contradictions, the deep contradictions within the co-op movement. Contradictions that indicate that the co-op movement internationally is at a crossroads. There is a crisis of identity going on in the co-op movement. There's a crisis of purpose. What is the role of co-ops? And what is the role of movement generally? And ultimately, a crisis of legitimacy. In Greece, and in many of the Eastern European countries, in Romania, in Croatia, in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, you really can't talk about co-ops very comfortably because they have such a rotten reputation as extensions of state-controlled command and control systems, as nests of corruption, of clientelism. And ultimately, when the state withdrew for ideological reasons, for economic reasons, its support of cooperatives in Eastern Europe, many of them collapsed. And so this points to a profound rethink, I believe, of how the co-op model and the co-op movements and the co-op system needs to reorient itself and reorganize itself in a manner that is closely aligned with its original economic and political purposes. This is an ongoing struggle within the co-op movement, and it's not clear how it's going to turn out. But it is clear that the model, in its principles and in its impact, when it's positive, shows a way to humanize the economy by reconnecting social values to the marketplace. It's not enough on its own. It also needs to be extended into the operational logic, I believe, of government and of the state. How to take these models of radical democracy, one member, one vote, into a new form of relationship between citizens and civil organizations and the operations of government and the state. In addition, what's becoming important is that the co-op model must also understand how it can become a mechanism, an instrument, and a means of generating and operating new forms of commons. I won't spend a lot of time on co-ops and commons because I don't have a lot of time. But Michelle and others have talked about the importance and the emergence of commons. As an idea and as a practice, they predate cooperatives as a form of social institution. But they are now re-emerging in important ways because of the impact and the effects of technology, digital technology, communication systems, and the ways these are now recreating commons in new and very powerful ways. But what it does mean is that there's a need for a convergence, a new alignment between the co-op models of the past and the emerging commons models of the present, and they each have a mutually beneficial role to play. Cooperative structures can help protect and expand and institutionalize commons, and the commons can help refine, redefine, and expand a social role for cooperatives. So, wrapping all of these ideas and these sort of themes together, how might this kind of political transition actually operate, and what might it look like in a real economy and in a real example? So I'm going to try and illustrate some of these ideas and how they operate in the example of Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy. Some of you may have heard much of this information. I started talking about Emilia-Romagna and the cooperative economy there about 16 years ago. And so it's become much more commonly known than it had been. But it is still an extraordinary story, and it is undergoing changes, which I think are also illustrative for us. It's a region in northern Italy, about 4 million people in the population. There are 20 regions in Italy. Emilia-Romagna is one of them. The city of Bologna is the capital city. And consistently, since the last 30 years, when this model really began to sort of crystallize in this region, the GDP per capita in Emilia-Romagna has been consistently about 30% above the national average in Italy. At the end of the Second World War was among the lowest and poorest economic regions in Italy. It is now the second most economically successful region of Italy, and the 10th in all of the, I think it's 120, 121 economic regions in Europe. So this is the city of Bologna. And I guess in all my travels, it still stands as the best example that I know of a functioning cooperative economy at a municipal level, at scale. It's a medium-sized city, but the political and economic and social institutions all are intertwined and based very much on a cooperative notion of political economy. But even these are now under stress. So when I talk about a co-op economy, I'm talking about the instance of Emilia-Romagna is an example of what I call managed cooperation that is interlinked and managed through three connected spheres. The first is the cooperative sector and the social economy. The second is the public sector. And the third is the capitalist economy, the private sector. what has been so important for the rise of a cooperative system here is the role of government, is a history of socialist and communitarian politics in this region. This is called the Red Belt in Italy because of the strong communist and socialist political traditions in this region. The regional government of Emilia-Romagna has been since it was formulated. The regional level of government in Italy really didn't become institutionalized until the early 1970s. 1973, I believe, is the date when regional governments were actually organized in Italy. Before that, it was the federal government and local comune, or the municipal governments. And even though the Constitution in Italy specifies that there are 3 levels of government, the regional governments being kind of the provincial level, they were never instituted because of fears that from the national governments in Rome, that if they were to create regional governments, the left would take over in those areas where they were strong, which of course is exactly what happened in Emilia-Romagna. The Communist Party in Emilia-Romagna took control of the government in elections when they were instituted in 1973, and it had a very particular notion about what political economy meant for a kind of reformist socialist tradition in Italy, which was very, very different than most of the socialist and communist traditions in the rest of Europe, actually even in the rest of Italy. They recognized the value and the importance of small and medium-sized firms, the private capitalist economy in Emilia-Romagna, and they developed a very, very close working alliance with trade unions and the cooperative movement to create an activist political and economic agenda in Emilia-Romagna that would focus on cooperation as being the driving force for economic development in the region. And cooperation not only in the form of co-ops, but also in the promotion of business networks, reciprocal business relationships, shared services, and partnerships among small and medium-sized firms. So what's really quite remarkable about the cooperative model in Emilia-Romagna is that it's not restricted to co-ops, that it has migrated out of the cooperative economy to deeply influence and restructure the private capitalist economy as well. So the social value of cooperation and the economic value of cooperation has been absorbed and incorporated into the business relationships of small and medium-sized firms in the region. And if one thing can actually account for the high degree of global competitiveness, of innovation, and of the capacity to really punch above their weight in terms of their size, it's been their ability, small, medium firms I'm talking about, it's been their ability to work together and cooperate so they can compete globally. This has been the secret of their success up until about 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, when the rise of China as a manufacturing center really, really began to take hold in the global economy and threaten the production systems of Emilia-Romagna. So an activist government, high levels of social capital, which were reinforced and reproduced by public policies that actually promoted and encouraged cooperation. High levels of entrepreneurial skill, and this very, very interesting braiding of cooperation among firms with competition. Italian businesses, small firms, are intensely competitive with each other, but they also know how to collaborate and to use cooperation as a foundation for productive competition. In other words, competition that really raises the bar and the skill level and the technical level and the level of innovation within firms and the skill levels of workers. That's the focus of the competition, is to raise the productive capacity and the skill capacity of firms. The focus is not to drive other firms out of the market, right? So they understand that the survival of those firms depends on the success and survival of other small firms in that economy. And that's one of the reasons why they cooperate. So what we have then is this very interesting confluence of progressive politics, of an economic ideology that is founded on the notion of social value and cooperation, and most importantly, institutional formation, the creation of local, regional, national, and international institutions that are capable of supporting and sustaining these forms of both social and economic cooperation. So the result has been extraordinary. There are over 8,000 co-ops in Emilia-Romagna. They account for about a third of the region's gross domestic product. Most Bolognesi belong to one or more co-ops. It's among the highest density of cooperatives in Europe, this particular region. And what's also quite extraordinary is that the co-op model, in other words, individual cooperatives have now emerged as major players within the Italian economy and then within the European economy. So if we take an example like an organization called Co-op. Co-op is a consumer co-op. It is the largest cooperative in Italy. It has linkages to wholesale consumer co-ops in Europe. It does bulk buying from right across Europe and beyond. And is the largest distributor of food in the country. It is also the developer of the largest retail outlets. Malls, super malls, and so on are controlled by this co-op organization. So in construction, in engineering, in human services, services to people with disabilities, services to seniors, education services, services to young people, services to people with addiction issues. They have the lion's share of the market in human services, cooperatives. In retail, as I said, and also in transportation. So the scale and the level and the power of the cooperative model within Emilia-Romagna is clear, but it is also now become evident for co-ops that have now emerged to the top of their industrial sectors, largely through their ability to consolidate and federate and cooperate smaller centers of operation, production, distribution, and so on. Right? So that is the cooperative sector in a nutshell. But the capitalist economy, as I said, is also organized around cooperative lines. There's about 400,000 small firms in Emilia-Romagna, about 1 for every 10 residents in the region. They are organized around sectoral and geographic lines. They are organized around industrial districts that focus and organize industrial production in key sectors in very specific geographic locations, which promotes cooperation and reciprocity among them. And they are supported through a whole series of trade and business associations that support services that they share. When I talk about their district, flexible manufacturing networks, and the way they sort of co-locate in specific districts, they use what has been called a cluster model of development, in which each of these, if we talk about a design firm, for example, in furniture, typically the anchor firm is the firm that actually does the design of the furniture, but the production process is subcontracted out to other small firms. Again, most of them, 99% of them being small family-owned firms that specialize in one or another aspect of the production process. And collectively, they cooperate to co-produce the final product for export. So this is true in the specialized food industry. It's true in the textile industry, in footwear, in ceramics, in furniture, in agricultural machinery, and so on and so on. So this has been in the past a very, very powerful and successful model of cooperative industrial organization for small-scale firms, and it is, in a sense, the interpretation of the co-op model for the small firm capitalist economy. Okay? So the regional government has been a key player in the promotion of this kind of cooperative development for both the co-op economy and for the small firm economy in the region. So what we have is really an institutional ecosystem that has been produced by a combination of the political and economic history of the enterprises and the cooperatives in this region, and an activist regional government that recognizes the value of this cooperative model as a driver of a new form of political economy and of economic development that actually distributes and democratizes the production of wealth. And if you compare, for example, levels of inequality between Emilia-Romagna and other regions of Italy, Emilia-Romagna is far more equitable in terms of the disparity, for example, between the average wage earned by an employee in a firm and the CEOs, or in terms of how much of that surplus is generated from the economy is actually reinvested in things like infrastructure, roads, education, research, and so on. So there is very positive and very powerful enabling legislation and public policy that supports this kind of cooperation. If you wanted to access, for example, European research grants to develop a product and you're a small entrepreneur, you will not be able to access those European monies unless you're actually cooperating with other firms that are going to share that information and share the benefits of that information. There's co-op development programming. There are targeted financial and tax supports. In financial services, in the cooperative movement, 3% of the surplus that's generated by co-ops is reinvested in co-op development funds that are then allocated towards the support and expansion of cooperative forms of enterprise, not just in Emilia-Romagna, but right across of Italy. So these are institutional supports that sustain this form of cooperative economy, both for the co-op sector and for the capitalist economy. I'm just going to close on this point. There's been a rise also, sort of alongside this traditional form of member-driven and member-serving cooperation, the rise of open cooperativism. In other words, a form of co-op that is oriented towards the provision of support and services, not only for its own members, but for the community as a whole. And this has especially become evident in the provision of social care, healthcare services, services for the elderly, people with disabilities, and so on. These co-ops, called social co-ops, here they're called solidarity co-ops. Like this one here, which is an elder care cooperative called Cagliai. It's one of the largest social co-ops among the real pioneers in elder care in Italy. Provides elder care services. They have operated clinics in partnership with local municipalities, and they're among the largest employers for adult educators and caregivers in Italy. There are about 180,000 people now that work in social co-ops in Italy, and about 30,000 are disadvantaged individuals who receive particular care and support within the legislation that supports social co-ops in Italy. Over 87% of the social services in Bologna are provided by social co-ops under contract to the municipality, which means that the local municipal level of government has a crucial role to play in the creation of these forms of cooperative and civil care to citizens. Another example of the use of open cooperatives is an organization in Bologna called Lapsus, which has an urban commons project, which has developed a protocol for how municipalities can work with citizens to create new forms of public commons, whether they're plazas or the creation of parks or the maintenance of public sidewalks and the porticos of Bologna and so on. The Bologna Regolamento has become now a model that has been adopted by some 24, 25, I'm not sure how many cities in Italy alone have now adopted this protocol for collaboration between citizens and their local municipality for the creation and protection of new forms of urban commons. So this points to the last point I just kind of want to close on, which is the idea of the partner state. If we are seriously talking about the creation of a new form of political economy based on the notion of cooperation, of empowering citizens, of supporting citizen engagement with not just governance issues, in other words, elections and politicians and so on, but actually generating the day-to-day systems that they rely on a day-to-day basis to live their lives communally, which is things like schools, things like social care, like health care, the maintenance of public spaces. The idea of the partner state is a notion of the state seen as an enabling state. Understanding, as the regional government did 30 years ago in Emilia-Romagna, that there is an intimate connection between the success and thriving of a region when it happens between an activist government that develops institutional measures to engage and support the cooperation and activism of citizens and firms. So it means a citizen, a partner state that facilitates the mobilization of civil society for the production of social goods in service to the common good. That becomes the focal point for an activist government. The practice of generative democracy, not passive, not every 4 years, but an ongoing involvement of citizens through their citizen-controlled organizations, be they commons, be they co-ops, to generate social goods that people enjoy and utilize in common. And it means the democratization of government through the incorporation of cooperative systems for co-producing public policy and for being held accountable to citizens that depend on those policies, whether it's for healthcare or education, or the maintenance of their streets. So what emerges out of this notion, I think, of the partner state is the creation of a new balance between state, civil, and commercial power, and the promotion and institutionalization of social economy and what I call social markets. In other words, the operation of markets that actually value and reinforce and support reciprocity, the exchange of mutual relations for mutual benefit among citizens and among civil organizations. So this is what I believe entails in a transformative political economy. The transformation at strategic systems levels of politics and governance, of the economy and markets, and of strategic sectors like energy, social care, finance and banking, land and housing, knowledge, education and research. These are strategic sectors that can be democratized. They can be cooperativized. And there are models to show how they operate and where they have worked. The task is conjoining these models and these systems of change, co-ops, commons, and the whole focus on sustainability, both politically and economically and environmentally, to create political economies and economic systems that are actually focused on common benefit and the mutual advantage of all the citizens in the economy, not just the privileged few. Synergia, it's indicated here, is one project that I'm involved in, Michelle's involved in, and others that is focused on weaving together the models and the knowledge and the practice among commons, co-ops, and sustainability movement to actually create this kind of template for a new form of political economy that is radically democratic. Maybe I should just leave it there. All right.